Hello, this is Michelle Miller from Human Anatomy and Physiology, and I'm going to give you a breakdown of some of the tissues that we're going to be talking about this quarter. This might be a review for some of you who have taken another biology class that talked about tissues extensively, but it's best that we all kind of start on the same page. So if you remember that tissues are the next level up in the hierarchy of biological organizations. So these are aggregations of cells, aggregations, with a similar structure and function. And remember that structure tends to follow function. So if we're talking about a tissue that absorbs nutrients, for example, it probably needs to be pretty thin in order to allow the nutrients to move through. And it also tends to need a large surface area, because the larger the surface area, the greater the rate of diffusion across the surface of the tissue. So when we look at tissues, there are 4 categories. And we are only going to focus today on 2 of those specific categories. So there is nervous tissue, which we're not going to talk about today. Next quarter, we spend extensive amounts of time on the nervous system. There's also muscle tissue, and we're not going to talk specifically about muscle tissue today, but there are 3 different kinds of muscle tissue, and one of which is cardiac muscle. And so when we start talking about the heart, we'll talk about cardiac muscle tissue. And then there's also smooth muscle. And so smooth muscle is involuntary, and one of the places where it's found in the body would be in your blood vessels. And so when we study the blood vessels in the cardiovascular system, we'll talk about smooth muscle. The other 2 tissues we're going to talk about today are the epithelial tissues. And epi means upon, and thelial tends to mean a layer. So we're going to talk more about epithelial tissue in a minute. And then we have the connective tissues. And obviously, we're going to talk about connective tissue extensively this quarter, because we're talking about the skeletal system, which is composed of connective tissue. But we're also talking about blood, which is also a form of connective tissue. So let's talk about kind of the overview of the tissues that are found in our body. And I want to remind you that there are organs in our bodies that are composed of multiple types of tissues. So even the biceps muscle that is shown here is not composed of solely skeletal muscle, but rather it has connective tissue sheath around it, the muscle fascia, and it also has, or it's also innervated by blood vessels and nerve tissue. And so there are lots of different tissues that make up an organ. Before we talk about epithelial tissue and connective tissue, I wanted to talk a little bit about cell junctions. Because when we think about going from a cell to a tissue, there's obviously kind of a leap in the hierarchy of organization. So how do cells, which are surrounded by an extracellular matrix, how do they form connections with other cells? And so when we look at these cell junctions, this is actually from chapter 3 in your anatomy book, and this is page 67 through 68. When we look at the cell junctions, there are 3 main types. The first one being tight junctions. And tight junctions are really important in that they create an impermeable barrier. So that if you think about the lining of the bladder, for example, that is epithelial tissue. And we wouldn't want urine to move through that epithelial tissue and get into the underlying smooth muscle tissue. And so tight junctions prevent, they're kind of impermeable, and they prevent the movement of substances across the surface of the tissue. The second junction are what are referred to as desmosomes. And desmosomes are like rivets. And so they actually anchor cells to one another. So for example, if we're talking about muscle cells, when a muscle cell contracts, it is connected to other muscle cells, and then the whole group, the whole tissue, the whole muscle tissue will contract. And so those desmosomes create an anchor by which the cells can contract. And then when we also talk about the skin, there's also anchoring in the skin cells that prevent the skin from being torn, for example. Another type of cell junction is called a gap junction. And like its name, it means that there's actually holes or gaps between cells. So these are protein channels. Oops, let's write protein. Between cells that allow for the movement of substances, that allow for the direct rather than diffusion across the cell surface. So the direct movement of substances across the cell surface. Okay. So let's take a look at these. There's an image in your book that you should study, and it looks something like this. And so this just shows a group of epithelial tissues. So this could be, example, the lining of the intestine, for example. This just shows it's a single layer of column-shaped cells. And this is what is referred to as the basement membrane, where the epithelial tissue is anchored. So when we look at this, this would be the tight junctions. And so notice it's kind of like stitching. It's really creating an impenetrable seal between the tissues. And this is protein-based. All of these are protein-based. We also have desmosomes, which anchor, right? And so they sometimes referred to as molecular Velcro. And so this creates an anchoring so that it reduces internal tension when cells move. And then this, for example, would be the gap junctions. And so these are proteins that create pores in the plasma membrane. And then ions, and this is really important when we start to talk about the electrical charge between heart muscle cells or cardiac muscle cells, because cardiac muscle cells are connected via gap junctions. And so ions can just travel right across there and cause the contraction of subsequent cardiac muscle cells that allows for the contraction of the whole heart as a complete organ. Okay, so that kind of gives us the link between a tissue and a cell. And so we're going to focus on the epithelial tissues and the connective tissues today. So epithelial tissues are cells that line the inside and outside of organs and also make up the epidermis. Actually, let's just put line the inside, sorry. Inside of organs. The outside I was thinking of was the skin. And make up the epidermis. And the epidermis, dermis means skin. And so this is the outermost layer of the skin. That's a D. Epidermis, that's the outermost layer of the skin. And deep to the epidermis is the dermis. So the epidermis is actually upon the dermis. So when we look at epithelial tissues, they are classified according to their cell shape. So for example, we could have flat cells, which are called squamous. We could have cuboidal, which are cube-shaped cells, and we could have columnar. So that's one way that epithelial tissues are classified. The other way is their layers. So the layers, they would be simple, meaning that there is a single layer, or stratified, which means that there is many layers. So whenever we see stratified, this is a protective function, whereas simple tends to be in places that do not get a lot of mechanical friction, for example, and also where there needs to be easy diffusion across the surface of the cell. So for example, when we look at our inside of our mouth, it is stratified epithelial tissue, but when we look at the inside of our lungs, it is simple epithelial tissue because oxygen needs to diffuse across, and we need protection when we look at the inside of the mouth against friction. So we can put these things together. So you could say that something is simple squamous, which means that it's a single layer of flat cells. You can also say that something is stratified squamous. So this would be like in our lungs, where gas exchange takes place between the atmosphere and our blood. Stratified squamous is our epidermis, for example. And that means that our outermost layer of skin is actually dead stratified squamous cells that are continually being replaced by a basal layer of cells that undergo mitosis. And then the cells migrate to the surface, they die, they become keratinized, and they're actually sloughed off to the environment. So we're constantly sloughing off the skin and it is replaced. But this is an example of stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Now there is another example of a layer that is referred to as pseudo-stratified. And so pseudo means false. And so this means that it looks stratified, but it's not, okay? So looks stratified, but it is not. So for example, when we look at our trachea, this is the place where we see this type of cell. And in our trachea, we have examples of pseudo-stratified, ciliated. So this means that there's little cytoplasmic extensions on the surface of the cell that kind of look like this. So if I drew my cell, there's little cytoplasmic extensions. That's the cilia. And then this would be the nucleus. And it's pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue. And this is in our trachea. Okay. Now the trachea also has inside of it special cells that are called goblet cells. And goblet cells tend to have a big structure inside of them. And so the goblet cell is producing mucus. And it is also, we'll talk about this, it is also a type of epithelial. It's considered to be epithelial tissue. So this is my goblet cell. And the goblet cells produce mucus. And so the trachea produces mucus to capture debris that is taken into the lungs. And then the cilia are really important because they actually move the mucus back up the trachea, and then we cough it up and we swallow it or we spit it out. But there's actually a lot of mucus that we actually just swallow. And this is happening all the time. And so people that smoke tend to have damaged cilia. And so you probably, if you've ever lived with a smoker, sometimes when they wake up in the morning, they cough and they cough and they cough and they spit up a bunch of mucus. And that is because they don't have the cilia to continually move the mucus up during the evening or while they're sleeping. And then the mucus starts to accumulate in the lungs, and that can lead to bacterial infections like pneumonia. Okay, so that's an example of epithelial tissue. So one thing about epithelial tissue is that when we look at it, this would be simple squamous. You'll notice that because it is lining the inside of a structure or the outside of the body, like right here, you have a surface called the apical surface. So you need to know that term. Apical means surface, means next to the space. And so in this case, it could be, for example, in a capillary of the circulatory system, and that space could be the lining of a capillary, and blood could be flowing through that capillary. Or it could be the lining of the alveoli in the lung, where gas exchange takes place. So that's simple. This would be stratified, right? And so you have many layers. It's also stratified squamous because they tend to be flat. And the apical surface here would be on the outside. So it's important to realize that the basal surface what anchors the epithelial tissue to the underlying tissue. Okay. So here, as I mentioned before, this would be a diagram of the lung. So these are little sacs deep, deep, deep in the lung where oxygen actually goes from air that's in these alveoli into the capillaries where they can be delivered out to the cells in the body, and CO2 is removed and then we breathe it out. And so you can see that these cells are very thin and they're flat, and you can kind of see the nuclei, which are dark purple in staining. So when we look at people that have emphysema, which we'll talk about not this quarter but the third quarter, their lining is thicker. And then some of the alveoli have collapsed, and so there's actually not as much surface area over which diffusion of the gases can take place. So this is the example of the pseudostratified columnar. And one of the reasons why it looks pseudostratified is because the nuclei are at different levels. But if you look at it, it's just a single layer. So if you follow the cell all the way through, it's just a single layer, but it's the way that they're arranged. You can also see the cilia, and then you can see the goblet cell, this is the mucus cell. Okay, so that would be in the lining of the trachea. The trachea itself, we'll talk about, is actually composed of cartilaginous rings that help to support its structure. Okay, so all glands in our body are considered to be epithelial tissue versus nervous or connective or skeletal. So just remember that all glands in the body are classified as epithelial tissue. Now we have two major categories of glands, one being exocrine and the other being endocrine. So exocrine means to the outside. So these are glands that secrete their substances via ducts. So they secrete substances via ducts. And so a good example of this would be salivary glands secrete their saliva into the mouth via a duct or a group of ducts. We also have mammary glands, which are milk glands, right? We also have sweat glands. So those would all be examples of exocrine glands. We also have endocrine gland, and an endocrine gland secretes its products into the circulatory system. So these are called hormones. So the products of endocrine glands are called hormones, and they are really important because they help to regulate homeostasis in the body. And they are kind of the long-term regulators, whereas the nervous system tends to be fast and short-term. The hormone tends to be long-acting and slow. So for example, we have the thyroid gland up in the neck region, and it secretes its product into the blood, and one of its hormones is called thyroxine. And almost all the cells in the body respond to thyroxine because this regulates metabolic rate. So that means that how fast cells are breaking down substances and producing energy. So you probably have heard of people being hypothyroid, hypo meaning low, meaning that their metabolic rate is too low and they tend to gain weight and they tend to be cold and they're tired all the time, versus hyperthyroid, where they tend to I can't remember the disease, but the hyperthyroid disease is where you're hot all the time, you lose weight, and you tend to just be really irritable because your metabolic rate is so high. Oh, it's called Graves' disease. Okay, so that is an example of an endocrine gland. Now, sometimes glands are also classified as to their structure. So this is more function, I guess, but their structure. So simple versus compound, for example, and tubular versus alveolar. Another term for alveolar that scientists use or biologists use is acinar, which means berry-like. Alveolar refers to a structure that kind of looks like this. So like in the lungs, we have alveoli, and that's the structure. Tubular means that it's just a tube, right? And there's no big ending in it. Simple means that there's no branching, and compound means that there's lots of branching. So if we look at a diagram that shows these, oops, I wanted to show that too. This is the simple tubular, this is branch, this is compound. So notice how there's many, many, many branches. And so the small intestine would be an example of that. Here's the alveolar. So mammary glands are actually compound alveolar glands because they have big structures here and they're branched. Okay. Sebaceous glands are also alveolar. We're going to talk about those in a second, because sebaceous glands produce sebum, which is kind of an oil that helps to lubricate the skin and keep it from cracking. Okay, so it's important. I wanted to mention that there is an example of unicellular, so this would also be on structural classification, unicellular, cellular versus multicellular. Okay, so the goblet cell is an example of a unicellular gland that would be like, for example, in the stomach, because our stomach, our epithelial tissue of our stomach produces mucus, and the mucous membrane is what keeps our stomach from being self-digested. So here you can see the rough ER. So in cell biology, you learned about the different organelles in the body. So there's a DNA, piece of DNA here, a gene that codes for mucin, and mucin is a protein. That gene gets transcribed and then it goes out to the rough ER where it's translated, and then you have these secretory vesicles containing proteins. And notice how they would migrate out to the surface, and then they release their mucin, and then the mucin combines with water to form mucus. So the example of a unicellular would be a goblet cell that produces the protein mucin, which makes mucus. Okay. Multicellular would be most all other glands. So sweat glands, right? Mammary, sebaceous. So really the only unicellular one that we have that we can talk about is, so we'll just put all others, is the goblet cells. Okay, so there's also a classification as to how the substances are secreted. So we could put here classified as to secretion method. So we'll just put secretion method. So I just showed you the secretion method of a goblet cell, and most Most glands secrete, exocrine glands would secrete it into that fashion, and also endocrine glands. And so this is merocrine. Merocrine. And this means that we have vesicles that travel to the plasma membrane and release their substances via exocytosis. Substances. So exocytosis is just where the vesicle fuses with the outer membrane and the substances is produced. So like sweat glands. So sweat contains a lot of water, but it actually also contains enzymes, and it actually also contains antimicrobial factors, and it also tends to be a little bit acid. So sweat is protective as well as involved in thermoregulation. So that's merocrine. This is holocrine, and holocrine, the example would be the sebaceous glands. And so you notice here that the cells actually die. So this is actually showing mitosis. So cells deep in the gland undergo mitosis, and then they migrate up. And then what happens is that pieces of the cells fragment off. And that would be sebum, which is actually kind of annoying in that it is what creates whiteheads, and then when it's oxidized, blackheads. Also leads to pimples, right? Acne. But it's important because if you didn't have sebaceous glands, your skin would crack and it would bleed. And sometimes we don't produce enough sebum during the winters, and like your knuckles, especially when you get older, your knuckles will crack and bleed and become really painful, okay? So holocrine is cells fragment and release secretions, let me spell it right, secretions and cell fragments. So this is an example of this is the sebaceous glands in the skin. They release their product, which is called sebum. And it functions in lubrication of the skin. Okay. So that was it for the epithelial tissue, what you need to know for the quizzes and the midterm exam. And next we're going to start talking about connective tissue. One thing that I mentioned that I forgot to mention about epithelial tissue, which I'll write up here, is epithelial tissue is not vascular, which is kind of interesting because what that means is that it does not have blood vessels in it. So we say that it is avascular. A means without, vascular means blood vessels. It's avascular, but it is innervated. So that means that there are nerves that run in the epithelial tissue. So example would be the skin, and even like cells, yeah, in the skin that can detect touch, for example. So that would be example of innervation. Okay, I wanted to mention that because some connective tissue, most connective tissue is actually vascular, but cartilage is not. Okay, so that is one of the reasons why if you get a cartilage tear in your knee, for example, it is very, it's unlikely that your body would actually be able to repair the damage, and that's why they do orthopedic surgery to remove that damaged cartilage, okay? But let's look at connective tissue and why all these different various types of tissues are grouped together. So the first reason is that this connective tissue has a common embryonic origin. So what that means is that we all start out as a single cell, and as that cell divides, you get groups of cells located in different areas. And the area that is going to make up the bone, the blood, cartilage, and fat, for example, are all found in the same area. So they have a common embryonic origin. And this is specifically called mesenchyme. So the tissue, the embryonic tissue that makes up connective tissue is called mesenchyme. Okay. So if we look at connective tissue, and another thing that it has in common is that we have a matrix. So we have cells located in a matrix. So that means that the matrix is actually not cellular, it's acellular, and it's made up primarily of proteins like fibers, like collagen fibers. And these cells sit in this matrix. Okay. So if we look at examples, okay, what constitutes connective tissue? One obvious example is bone, and we also have blood. And we're going to talk extensively about blood and bone later. We also have cartilage. Oops, cartilage. We also have tendons and ligaments. So tendons and ligaments, which we'll talk about when we get to the skeletal system. Tendons connect bones or muscles to bones. Ligaments connect bone to bone. We also have what is referred to as connective tissue proper. So this is the type of connective tissue that connects it lies between the in-between different tissue types, and it is really important in creating space and also allowing nutrients to move in and be absorbed, and water to move in and to be absorbed by other tissues. So we're going to talk about this connective tissue proper in a minute. Okay, so let's look at the components of connective tissue. Of all connective tissue, we'll say. Okay, so when we look at the matrix, we have what is called the ground substance. And the ground substance contains proteins called proteoglycans. And these actually combine with carbohydrate chains. So if you remember carbohydrates, those are sugars. And when you have many sugars bound to one another, those are called polysaccharides. So we have these proteoglycans plus the glycosaminoglycans. Okay. So these glycosaminoglycans are sometimes referred to as GAGs, right? And the whole purpose of these proteins and the glycosaminoglycans in the matrix, well, what are the major purposes? Is that they trap water. So they attract and trap water. And that is important because a lot of the connective tissue has lots of water stored in it. And so example would be that 80% of the mass of cartilage is water. So you might have heard of these before, because sometimes these are promoted as what are called nutraceuticals. So nutraceuticals are things that you can buy like at the pharmacy over the counter that are supposed to help with your, in this particular instance, with your joints. And so you might get chondroitin sulfate, which is a precursor to these GAGs, right? GAG, so that's a precursor to that. Although this is a very large molecule and it's probably, you know, is broken down by your digestive tract. And so there's some concern that maybe this molecule is so broken down that it is not actually beneficial. It doesn't ever actually get directly to the joints, right? Because it's got to go through your digestive system first before it is absorbed. So that's one. Sometimes that is in the form of shark cartilage. And then there is, you might take, if you have bad joints or arthritis, you might take glucosamine, which is also a precursor to glycosaminoglycans. And this one is maybe a little bit more reasonable because it's small. And so it might be readily absorbed. And so there's lots of controversy over, and studies being done that show that these might not really make any difference. They might just be kind of a placebo effect on the cartilage. And so they might not, you know, make the dried out cartilage more fluid and increase joint fluidity after all. So you have to kind of be a little bit skeptical if you're going to spend a lot of money on joint nutraceuticals and question whether or not they are useful. Okay, so if we look at a picture of the proteoglycans and the glucosaminoglycans, okay, this is the proteoglycan. Actually, this is the core protein, right? And then this is the carbohydrates that come off of it. And you might have heard of hyaluronic acid, so that's also a part of this proteoglycan. And then these are the carbohydrates that trap water. And so if you have lots of these, your cartilage and other types of connective tissue are going to be more fluid rather than viscous. Okay. And that's important when we talk about fluidity of joints and movement of the joints. Okay, so that's the ground substance. The other thing that is found in our matrix, so the ground substance makes up the part of the matrix, so we'll just put part of matrix. The other thing that we find is fibers. Okay. And fibers are structural proteins versus like globular proteins, which dissolve in water. Structural proteins are not do not dissolve in water, and so they remain outside. They remain in the matrix. And we have 3 different types. So we have collagen, we have elastic fibers, and we have reticular. So collagen is really super abundant in the body. So it is like the most abundant, one of the most abundant. So albumin is also really abundant, but collagen is most abundant proteins that we have in our body. And so this is also the most abundant within the matrix. So structural proteins in matrix. So it's outside the cells, okay? So this is the most abundant. And these are white. So this is why bones are white, for example, why cartilage is white. Elastic means that the fibers that are elastic are able to store energy and then release it. And so they kind of bounce back, right? So some of our connective tissue, like that surrounding our aorta, a major blood vessel coming out of our heart, needs to have elastic fibers in it. So when the blood pushes on the walls will push back, right? So that's elastic. You also can feel the elasticity in the outer ear, okay? Reticular means that it has many spaces, and so it creates many spaces, so it's branched and creates many spaces. So we'll talk about where our reticular connective tissue is located. So if we look at a diagram, these would be the cells, right? So we can see the cells that have the nuclei. We can see this fluid-like substance. This is the ground substance. It has proteins, proteoglycans in it. And then we can see the different fibers. So the reticular fiber right here is branched. This is my elastic fiber. And then notice that the collagen fibers are white and they're large, okay? So we also have cells in our connective tissue. So this would be like the third thing. So we had ground substance in the matrix, and then we had fibers in the matrix, and the cells secrete the matrix. Okay. So when we look at cells, we can identify them based upon their names. So for example, we have chondrocytes versus osteocytes. So chondro means cartilage, osteo, like osteoarthritis, means bone. So this would be cartilage and bone, okay? So we can kind of notice, you know, what types of cells are involved. We can also look at the ending, so not just the beginning, but the ending gives us information. So cyte means that it is a mature cell secreting matrix. Blast, so we could have chondroblasts, mean that it is an immature cell. And then we could also have clasts. So we could have osteoclasts, for example. And these are cells, so these build matrix. We'll put, the mature cell, we'll say maintains the matrix. So the immature cell builds matrix. And then the class are cells that break down the matrix. Because interestingly, our bone is living tissue, and it has to be built and then broken down and rebuilt every few years. So our skeleton is actually not a static organ. That is why when people go up in outer space and they don't use their skeleton weight-bearingly, then their skeleton actually starts to become weaker because their skeleton is broken down faster than it is rebuilt based upon the forces that are exerted on the bone, okay? We also have other cells besides those that secrete the matrix or break it down or maintain it. And these could be white blood cells. So like neutrophils are white blood cells that eat debris, and macrophages are also cells that eat the debris. And so they can go in there and eat the debris. And so perhaps maybe if you have torn cartilage or if you have a ruptured disc, the macrophages would eventually over time actually go in and clean up the debris in the connective tissue. Okay, so let's look at this diagram right here. So we have a lymphocyte, that's a white blood cell. Macrophage, that's a white blood cell. Fibroblast, okay, so this cell is actually secreting and producing these fibers, okay? And then here's a fat cell. Notice that this connective tissue, this is loose because there's lots of space, there's lots of water, and then this connective tissue is also vascularized, and so it has capillaries in it that are delivering nutrients directly to the cells that are in the connective tissue. Okay, so let's look at the difference between connective tissue proper, okay, and then we'll talk about cartilage and bone a little bit. So connective tissue proper can be broken down into loose, so I'll create a little concept map here, versus dense, okay? So loose, there's 3 different types. there is adipose. Okay, that is fat. We'll talk more about that in a second. We have areolar. That is actually the most abundant connective tissue we have in our body. And then we have reticular. Okay. Dense, we have regular versus irregular, and then also elastic. So we have regular, dense connective tissue, irregular, and then regular. Oops, sorry. I already put that one down. Elastic. Okay. So connective tissue, you could have dense, regular, which would be like tendons, irregular, which is like some muscle fascia is that, and also joint capsules. And then elastic is that which is found, there's a little bit in our blood vessels, major arteries, and then there's also a little bit in the ligaments that support our vertebrae. Okay, so let's look at the adipose tissue. So adipose. Okay, so we have actually different types of adipose tissue. So most of our adipose tissue is white fat, right? And the primary component, the primary reason we have white fat, well, there's two of them. This is insulation. And it's also storage of triglycerides, which can be broken down and can be used to produce ATP. And it's a really efficient way because triglycerides don't have water. They're lipids, so they repel water. So you can store a lot of energy in fat droplets because there's no water diluting it, right? So it's an efficient way to store energy, okay? So we'll say that these are energy. So white fat can be, when we look at the insulation factor, right, it can be subcutaneous. And that means that it is underneath the skin, or it could be visceral. And that means that it is in the body cavity. So this would be under skin, in the body cavity. Now we know from studies being done that visceral fat is worse in terms that if you have lots of visceral fat, like say for example, if you have a big belly, but it's hard, right? And so it's like this, it's all muscle, right? People are saying, oh, look at this, it's hard, my belly's hard, it's all muscle. But really what's happening is there's fat in the body cavity, which is pushing it out, the belly out. And so the fat is not underneath the skin, it's actually under the muscle. And so when we look at that, we see that visceral fat is actually linked to cardiovascular disorders more frequently than having lots of subcutaneous fat, which is under the skin. Subcutaneous fat also can be used as insulation, right? So we can, if you think about animals that live in the Arctic waters, like whales, right? They have lots of subcutaneous fat because it prevents heat loss. Okay? So it's insulative. Visceral fat can also be, can also cushion organs. So we actually have some white fat that surrounds our kidneys. It's actually not white. It actually has beta carotene in it. It stores vitamin B in it. And so it actually looks yellow. But we have this type of fat that is under or around our kidneys. And they actually keep the kidneys in position. And it actually it's kind of a shock absorber for the kidney too, so that if you do get kicked in the back, it will actually help protect. So the visceral fat around the kidney is actually really important. Without it, the kidney actually will drop out of its normal location, and that can be a real problem if it kinks and prevents the flow of urine out of the kidney and to the bladder. Okay. So that's white fat. So if we look at a diagram of this, oops, that's not, okay. So this is my white fat. So this is in your book. And notice that the nuclei are actually pushed up to the edge And then this fat droplet is in the center of the cell. So what you'll see is a clear fat droplet, and that is white fat or adipose tissue. Okay. Now, not in your book, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's really interesting, is brown fat. And brown fat has a high metabolic rate, and so it is actually not necessarily storing energy. The reason why it's brown is it has lots of mitochondria, which means that it breaks down substances and produces energy, and it produces heat. Okay, so it is actually a way that your body produces heat without shivering. And interestingly, there's lots of it in newborns. So newborns have much more. And so when you see newborns, even if they're really cold, you generally do not see them shivering, right? So they don't shiver. They just simply kind of sit there, maybe turn blue. But the newborns are using their brown fat to produce heat. We can have brown fat as well. And it's located primarily in adults up near the neck region. So if we look at, this is a diagram from a different book, but this is the difference between brown fat, right? Lots of mitochondria, little bit of fat, right? Makes it look brown versus a white fat cell. And then if we look at where it is located in babies or children, this is a young child, it's in, the neck region, down the belly, around the kidneys, between the clavicles, right? And then as we get older, then it just kind of stays here. And there's lots of interest to see if we can actually help people lose weight by increasing the amount of brown fat that is found in their bodies. So there's some evidence that if you turn down your heat and you have a cooler environment, that you will actually produce more brown fat, and that will actually help you burn calories that you might not necessarily would burn if it was warmer outside. Okay, so let's go back to this cell. This is actually called areolar connective tissue, and this is the most abundant connective tissue in our body. And so this is most abundant, and it has lots of space. So areolar means that it's got lots of space. And it stores water. Right? And if we look at it here, the epithelium is actually connected to the underlying tissues by the lamina propria, and that is areolar connective tissue. So this is widely distributed underneath your skin, and then packages organs and surrounds capillaries. And so kind of wraps and cushions organs. And it also has an immune function because it has macrophages. And so here you can see it's got collagen fibers and elastic fibers. And then you have the fibroblasts that are producing the matrix. And then there would also be macrophages in there that are feeding on debris. Okay, so areolar is connective tissue proper, and it is loose. So notice its looseness, right, means that there's not a lot of fiber, but there's more space. So when we get to the dense, you'll see that the fibers are more tightly packed. So dense means that there's more fibers. Loose means that there is less fibers. Okay. The last type is called reticular. And this forms a network. And this is found in your lymph nodes, which the lymph nodes filter lymph through the body. You have lots of lymph nodes in your body, but there's a lot in the neck region, there's a lot in your armpit region, and there's a lot in your groin region. And they filter the lymph, the fluid that gets pushed out of the capillaries and not immediately taken back up by the circulatory system. And so this is really important in holding macrophages. There's lots of macrophages, right? in the lymph nodes. And as the lymph goes through, the macrophages, the white blood cells, sense anything that is foreign, and then they'll start to attack it. Okay, so the network actually provides space for macrophages. So lots of macrophages. Another place where reticular connective tissue is in the spleen. And the spleen is kind of an interesting organ because it filters blood, but it removes dead and damaged red blood cells. And it can also store blood and platelets. And it also is composed of reticular and has macrophages that can eat the damaged red blood cells. And then we also have this in the bone. So when we talk about the bone marrow, it is actually composed of reticular connective tissue. And that is important because that is where all of our blood cells are produced. And the blood is also considered to be a connective tissue. Okay, dense connective tissue. So dense means that there are more fibers, right? And we have regular dense, right? So regular dense means that the fibers are running parallel to one another. And so this makes up tendons, which can connect muscle to bone. This also makes up ligaments, which connect bone to bone. Okay. We also have irregular dense, and this means that the fibers run in different directions. So around our joints, like around our shoulder joint, for example, we have joint capsules. So joint capsules are made of irregular, dense connective tissue. So this is a connective tissue that encapsulates the joint. This also makes up the dermis of the skin. Okay. The last one is elastic, dense. And this is found, for example, in they have elastic fibers, sorry. So elastic fibers. And so anything that will recoil, so if you bend it, then it pops back into shape, right? That would be elastic. And so the aorta is one place that this is located. And also some ligaments associated with the spine, with the vertebrates. Have lots of elastic fibers in them. So if we look at some examples of this, notice the collagen fibers are running all in one direction, right? So that is dense, regular. And so here it's showing the ligament in the shoulder, and it's also showing the tendon, the biceps femoris tendon. And then here you can see the fibers are running in all different directions, and that would be the joint capsule, and also right underneath the epidermis, that's the dermis of the skin. So the leather. So if you think about it, if you've ever taken a hide and scraped off the outside, that's the epidermis. And then when you get to the part where it starts to like get white and little fibers start to pop out of the hide, that is actually the dermis. And that is an example of dense, irregular connective tissue. So this is what we've talked about today would be the examples of all the connective tissue propers, be them loose or dense. And then in another lecture, we're going to talk about cartilage and also bone. And there's different types of cartilage in our body. The most common type of cartilage we have in our body is hyaline cartilage, but we also have a few other different types like fibrocartilage and elastic cartilage. And then we'll talk about bone as an example of a type of connective tissue as well. Okay, so that's it. This is my intro lecture to tissues. I hope you took notes, and you want to study those notes for quizzes and the midterm and the final exam.